Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the latest Offset live session. I'm Jess Eustace. I help out with product marketing here at Offset. And today's presenter is Sam Kim. He's engineer number one here at Offset and has been with the team for a good amount of time. And he's going to talk to y'all about the power of authorization. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sam.
All right, great. Thanks, Jess. Get the presentation started. So yeah, I will kick off our topic today, unlock the power of authorization. We're gonna go through our agenda first. So we're gonna do some introductions. I'm gonna introduce Authsed and talk a little bit more about my background. We're going to go through a brief overview of some authorization models, just so that we can be on the same page and have a common vocabulary through our conversation. And I'm going to identify some opportunity costs of things that you may not be aware of, or potentially you're making deliberate choices about by not having an adequate authorization solution. And I'm also going to introduce SpiceDB and Authsed and talk about how they might be able to help. During the course of our session, there may be some live polls that you can interact with, and we're going to have some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have any questions during the presentation, you're free to comment them in the chat, or you can save them at the end and ask them directly. So first, I'll introduce Authsed. We were founded in 2020 by our 3 founders. They have a history of entrepreneurship. They started a company called Quay, which was the first private container registry that was eventually acquired by CoreOS and Red Hat. And the story that they like to tell is that during their Quay days, they were pursuing the enterprise market, and as they were building features and just figuring out kind of as a product what they need to do to attract enterprise attention. They were encountering more and more complicated permissions requirements. And being engineers, and as engineers often do, they were just building their authorization directly into the application code. And so as they found that Quay grew both in usage and in complexity, they realized authorization related usage was actually taking more and more of their database CPU. And it got to a point where the vast majority of their compute was actually spent computing authorization instead of actually serving their product. And they eventually got to the point where they couldn't build or even launch built features due to the complexity of their authorization, their legacy authorization, and the limits and actually the risk of launching a new feature without knowing if their authorization was going to be correct. And so fast forward, they read the Google Zanzibar paper in 2019, and they realized that they could scratch their own itch. They found in the paper an approach to authorization that resonated, and they felt that could solve not just their problems, but problems that countless other startups and enterprise companies are encountering today. So that led them to start Authsed. That began their journey into the authorization world. More about me. I'm an engineer here at Authsed. I was employee number 1. So I've had the privilege to work on all sorts of things at the company. Previous to Authsed, I worked at Microsoft and Amazon, and also served as a technical consultant to startups, including Gusto. And in retrospect, my path to authorization actually started at Amazon. In my first exposure to what actually turned out to be a centralized authorization. Amazon is famous for having service-oriented architectures, and there's a service for everything. And so internally, we had a feature flagging service. And at the time, I didn't really think of it that way, but actually feature flagging is a form of authorization. You get to select who gets to see what via feature flags. And so the feature flagging service that I used quite often was basically enabling the experimentation and the data-driven approach we had to product development. And if you can imagine at Amazon, if you take the cross between the number of services, the number of features per service, across the number of experiments per feature, across the number of user segments per experiment, per feature, per service, you can imagine the complexity that the feature flagging service could handle. And in addition to the traffic that the various Amazon.com websites get. And so I learned the convenience and the benefit of using a centralized authorization service first in Amazon. And as a consultant to startups, I also ran through a very similar pattern, developing MVPs. A lot of times products tend to have a very simple authorization model. It's basically two simple roles, which is user and admin. A user gets to use their stuff and the admin gets to see everything. And then eventually, as the product grows, you layer on top more and more complex either frameworks or libraries, and rinse and repeat. So I got to see that pattern, you might call it an anti-pattern of authorization, a lot as startups grew. So we're going to jump into just a survey of authorization models. The first one is role-based access control. We like to call it RBAC. This is a approach you see quite often, and it's basically a user is assigned one or more roles. Roles are assigned permissions, and then users gain access to permissions by being active members of a role. And in the extreme cases, either the number of roles can explode when the number of permissions that are required in your applications grow, or permissions can get conflated in roles because you start stuffing different permissions all into the same role. But it is a nice way of thinking about permissions, which is why it's so prevalent. Attribute-based access controls, or ABAC, takes us a little bit further. You actually use attributes or characteristics of an object to evaluate access. You can apply this approach more naturally to things other than users. So if you are trying to define access to different kinds of objects or resources, those objects or resources can have different tags or machine-generated attributes that you can then use to determine authorization logic. And so once you have these attributes, the specific authorization logic used to interpret the access to them is often called a policy, and that can take any number of forms. And again, in the most extreme cases, ABAC is extremely flexible, but sometimes that comes at the cost of complexity or opaqueness. You can have a very, very large policy file, and the larger they get, that also often means that they're expensive to compute. RBAC, or relationship-based access control, you determine authorization based off of relationships between objects and resources. So this it goes further than ABAC by then now introducing these relationships. And so you can imagine the entities and the relationships between them form a graph, and that graph is actually used to evaluate permissions. And so very complicated authorization questions can be expressed via this graph. But again, in the extreme, this often requires a lot of forethought and planning to define the right schema to lay on top of the graph in order to be useful. And the last concept that I'll bring up, this is more of a something that can cross each of the models that I've talked about so far, is a centralized approach versus a distributed approach to accessing your authorization model. So a centralized source just means that either the data or the access to that authorization data is kept in a single authoritative source. And a distributed approach just means that data is distributed and the questions around authorization are answered closer to the decision points. And so with centralized authorization, the concern often becomes latency or availability. And with distributed approach, consistency becomes a question. That's a lot of acronyms. And this was very quick, and it was intended to be a survey of just the most familiar authorization models. So if you have more questions about these or need more resources, we can follow up with some at the end. Okay, now jumping into what potential opportunity costs you might be paying with your current authorization solutions. So I am going to be presenting these broken down by business organization. And these are intended to be hypothetical, but grounded in current data and current trends. So the hope and the intent is that these might resonate with some of the things that you may be experiencing. And I want to be able to surface them with some of these examples, and then hopefully provide some solutions at the end. So first, what opportunity costs are your product organizations paying? So having inadequate authorization solutions means that your product teams can't design the best product experiences. And as an example, a recent TechCrunch article highlighted B2B SaaS investments being one of the few areas of investment growth in 2024. And if imagine you are a startup and you want to pursue the growth in this area. And so you may have an existing product, and as you pursue enterprise customers expect certain things. One or two, namely billing by organization and team support. And if these aren't things that your authorization solution can support, they may prevent being responsive to your customers or potential customers, and product-led growth may not be a feasible approach. And so one question you might want to ask yourself is, how quickly can you enable your product teams when an opportunity arises? The next is the opportunity cost for security teams. So imprecise permissions can manifest as security problems. OWASP, which is a security-focused user group, they publish a top 10 report periodically, and they continue to update these reports with new data. So the number one issue that they highlighted in their 2021 report for application security was broken access controls. And one of the solutions that they recommended was to implement access control mechanisms once and reuse them throughout the application. And in their 2023 API security report, broken object level authorization was their number one issue they wanted to highlight. And again, they recommend implementing a proper authorization mechanism that relies on the user policies and hierarchy. And so one thing I wanted to emphasize for the opportunity cost here is that it's not just broken permissions that lead to security problems, it's actually imprecise permissions. With imprecise permissions, it just can have unintended consequences of not being able to express the proper level of granular detail in your permissions in your application. So opportunity costs for business, there's general compliance risk and the inability to respond to market trends, and which could then lead to lost revenue. So the Gartner, there's a Gartner Worldwide IT Spending Forecast survey that was published in late 2023 that highlighted that for major corporations, the largest growth category for spend is actually in software for corporations. And then, which means that as companies look to spend their software budget, you will have opportunities to then either go into these new growth markets or, as the next statistic shows, most CIOs are looking to increase their spend in both security and information security products. And so one of the questions that come up from that is, is your company able to expand into the markets, global markets that you aren't currently in? And can your application integrate with the new security products that may be brought on board? The other issue is that is your application ready for a heightened focus on security in the upcoming year? And authorization in your application, of course, is closely tied to the sense of security, both internal and external. And lastly, what are the opportunity costs that are paid by your engineering teams? And that goes just down to what are the velocity impacts that development bottlenecks have. So one model you see a lot in engineering organizations is that authorization is owned by a single team, often a platform team. And that means that all feature and product launches are dependent on a single team. And so what that often leads to is if that platform team is not resourced properly, you end up having conversations around priorities, and then unfortunately subsequent conversations around prioritization and negotiations around those. And so having a tool or a lack of a tool to enable this platform team to keep up with product launches is a concern. Another model is that the product teams themselves are responsible for building the authorization components of their own product or their own feature. And one of the issues there is that oftentimes product teams aren't necessary authorization experts. And so the implementation of the authorization specific features can either be imprecise or can take a little bit longer just because that's their domain of expertise. And so in my experience as a technical consultant, one of the rules of thumb that I presented engineering leadership when it came to estimating the cost and time of implementing permissions is listed there. This is just a high level estimate, but you take one engineer and then multiply that by 1 month plus 1 month of implementation, 1 month of QA, and 1 month of deployment. And you can kind of get a sense of the cost of implementing new permissions inside of a product team. So then what can an adequate or even an enabling authorizations do to unlock some of these costs? What can they unlock for you? And we believe here at Offset that SpiceDB can be an authorization solution that is flexible enough and to accommodate your complex authorization requirements and use cases while scalable enough to grow with you. And so we have SpiceDB at the foundation here, where it's open source, it's centralized, it can scale globally, and is consistent. And so a tagline for that is we believe that SpiceDB is a service that you can ask as a single source of truth and get back consistent answers with low latency. And that's no matter where your application is deployed. And it was also designed with Kubernetes in mind. And Auth is built on top of SpiceDB, and we provide managed infrastructure for SpiceDB. So we run SpiceDB with additional enterprise functionality on infrastructure that's deployed to accommodate your business. And one way to think about it is you tell us where you run your workloads, and we'll carry the pager for you. And so where can SpiceDB meet you where you're at currently with your authorization solution? And so here we have a few dimensions where SpiceDB can help. If you have reached a point of traffic scale, SpiceDB has been designed and tested at global scale. If you have reached a limit in terms of the complexity that you can manage, SpiceDB has flexible centralized authorization. And if you've reached a limit in terms of distribution, SpiceDB can be deployed globally. And so to conclude, for each of the business areas that we presented with different opportunity costs, would like to provide some areas where SpiceDB and Offset can help. And for your product teams, SpiceDB schema, it's a flexible configuration that can model complex authorization models. We actually have some open source schemas that you can see that model the authorization that you see a lot of times in popular products such as Google Drive, simple RBAC, more complicated ABAC approaches. And I also like to highlight a customer story that we have. So Turo launched the co-hosting feature. They came to a point in their product where their hosts were sharing their own login credentials with their employees in order to have multiple people be able to manage their account. Obviously, that is not a good situation. And so they followed this path of being able to identify that they needed new permissions requirements. They adopted SpiceDB and then eventually successfully launched with Offset Dedicated. For business, our Offset Dedicated product has an odd logging feature, and that can be used as input into any privileged access management solutions that you may have in place. And we also have multi-region support, meaning you can deploy in pretty much any region that your cloud provider has, and that will help you expand into any global markets. For your security teams, Offset Dedicated also has a restricted API management, and that'll help you exercise these privileged with the various clients that you have for your centralized permissions. And our open source SpiceDB Playground also has a feature where you can model your security constraints using assertions. And we also have a suite of integrations with different CI tools, and you can actually run your security tests with all your builds and before deployments. And then for your engineering team, the adoption of SpiceDB, it just hopefully brings a new paradigm where centralized permissions will allow your authorization logic to be decoupled from your application code so that your application code and your authorization code can actually evolve independently. And here at Offset, we started out as an open source company, and we are committed to open source development. We have a stance that all developer experience will always be open source. And so SpiceDB and the tooling on SpiceDB is built in the open. And so for takeaways, the things that we wanted to leave you with are there are often hidden opportunity costs by having an inadequate authorization solution. And SpiceDB was built by Offset to be flexible enough to model the most complicated permission use cases. And then once you have that in place, it'll scale globally for you when you need it. And then it was also built with enterprise requirements in mind. So it will continue to grow with you as your company grows. And if this resonates with you and you would like either an expert opinion on if SpiceDB or Offset can be helpful, you're welcome to schedule a call with us, and we'll happily review any of your use cases, help model your schema, whether you're adopting SpiceDB or looking to scale with Offset products. And with that, I will turn it to any Q&A.
I don't see too many questions in the chat, but I have some questions if we've got a little bit of time.
Sure.
Sam, I was wondering if you could talk about some things that I might want to consider before I just dive in and adopt SpiceDB.
Sure. I think it really does depend on where your starting point is with your current authorization solution. If you're coming from a monolith, meaning your authorization is currently built into your application code, SpiceDB will be a new paradigm because you'll be running a separate service that you'll have to interact with. That said, again, SpiceDB was designed to be low latency and highly scalable. And so You just have to be mindful that that is another paradigm that you have to introduce into your application development. But otherwise, there's a lot of new concepts, and I think as an engineer, it's always fun to kind of learn about different ways of approaching tools. So I think the best way to get started is to try modeling some schemas in the SpiceDB playground, and I think that'll be the first step in kind of like discovering the next set of questions that you'll have before adopting SpiceDB.
For sure. And so if I'm going to get started, like, should I dive into the world of SpiceDB before I reach out to Authsed? Like, how does that relationship kind of work?
Yeah, I think if you tend to be the type of person who likes to get your hands on to the things, and that helps form your form questions and kind of what you're interested in, I think we have resources that you can do that independently. So I mentioned the playground already. Our documentation has a lot of example tutorials. And our Discord community actually has a pretty lively user base that's active pretty much 24 hours a day, where you can ask questions of peers. We also have some our engineers in there who are answering questions as well. If you tend to be someone who likes to have more of a guided experience, you're also welcome to schedule a call simply to explore and see about presenting kind of high-level business requirements and seeing how we might be able to guide you to the right resources, or be able to answer questions about, how we might integrate with your business. So
Awesome.
2 options.
And it looks like one of our attendees has a question. So,
yeah, I think I can see it. So I'll read the question out loud, and I'll answer. So Sergey asks, Sam, what's your opinion on multiple SpiceDB instances per each product team versus a single global instance managed by a platform team? So we've seen both scenarios play out. So if each product team has a SpiceDB instance, and versus like having a single global managed instance for, I would imagine, the entire company or entire organization, the main difference is just shared authorization question answering. And so if the authorization questions are limited to each product and they never cross that boundary, one SpiceDB instance per team may be a good approach. That simplifies the ownership model internally. Each team can independently manage their own SpiceDB schemas, and assuming that they're comfortable managing the infrastructure of deploying SpiceDB, then everyone gets their own self-contained place to manage their authorization. The benefit of having a single global instance is that you may be able to have some economies of scale in terms of having better performance. And I guess one primary requirement is that authorization questions span different product groups. So for example, with Google products, for example, if you share a Google document in a Gmail email, and the recipient doesn't have permissions to that Google document, Google actually uses a single Zanzibar instance, similar to a SpiceDB instance, where they'll be able to detect that the recipient doesn't have access. And so cross-product, you'll be able to highlight that, by the way, this recipient doesn't have access to that Google document from within Gmail. And so if you have similar requirements where you need cross-product authorization, then a single global instance is your only approach. Does that answer your question, Sergey, or should I go into more detail about any particular part of the answer? You can comment in the chat.
looks like that worked out. So thanks, Sergey.
Great.
Well, we're right on the half hour, and so we don't want to take up everybody's day. So thanks so much, Sam, for sharing all this information. Thanks for everyone who attended, and if you're watching this later, thanks for hanging out with us for the last 30 minutes. Like Sam said, always feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk more about SpiceDB or AuthZed, and it was nice to have everybody here.
Thanks, Jess.
Thanks.